Okay, I think we're ready. So let's go through this by sections. I think that will make it a little bit more coherent. So let's just go back to the beginning. Start with respiratory stuff. So did you guys look at the example? Yes. Okay, so you get the idea for the format. Are we okay? I guess. So basically, you know, some things have just a little brief scenario and a few questions, and some things are a little bit more in depth. The question style is exactly the same as what you guys are used to. It's just in a little bit of context. Okay? So, questions on respiration. I
actually have a question about the example. The last question you asked was what component of her nervous system allowed her to figure that out. I don't remember ever...
You need to give me a little context because I don't remember what that is.
Sure. It says the woman was able to sense that the man was uncomfortable and backed off.
Okay, so that's looking at empathy. So what part of your nervous system allows you to sort of perceive other people's feelings and get a sense of what they're experiencing? Mirror neurons. Okay, remember them? So there's some research that indicates like kids with autism may not have functional mirror neurons, and that's why they don't relate to people. So anytime you can kind of put yourself in another person's position, it's your mirror neurons that are allowing you to do that. Any other questions from the example? Yeah.
There was a question about the barbecue sauce instead of barbecue, and you said to be specific. What did she do to cause you to hear voiceless instead of voiced plosives?
Yeah, so there what I was after was not anything like anticipatory co-articulation, which is probably the mind frame that you guys were all in from the tongue twister. In terms of voice onset time, what did she produce? So if a person is saying a plosive and you're perceiving it as voiceless, what does the voice onset time have to be? Greater than 30 milliseconds. Okay, so if it's a person who's over-articulating, like an opera singer might over-articulate like crazy, and it's a voiceless sound, theirs might be like, 120 milliseconds, way out there. And that would be what you'd expect with aspiration. Yeah. Would you hit some button? Thanks.
What laryngeal muscles did she use to increase loudness? Were you looking for one or two muscles, or which one?
If it says muscles, it's two, and if it's for increased loudness, you need two for medial compression, which would be what? Which two are going to close the vocal folds so that subglottal pressure can build up? Okay, I need someone to raise their hand. This blind murmuring isn't working. Who knows? Now, several people murmured, so somebody murmurs something. Go ahead.
The lateral cricoarytenoid and the intra-arytenoid?
Yeah, lateral cricoarytenoid is the one we usually think of for medial compression because it closes the membranous portion of the vocal folds. So really, that's the main one. But in order to really build up subglottal pressure, you also want the posterior glottal chink closed, and it's the intra-arytenoids that will do that. Okay, so for complete closure, to build up pressure, you need all of the vocal folds closed, lateral cricoarytenoid and the intra-arytenoids. Yeah.
On all of these questions, like for instance the one regarding the mirror neurons, are you looking for just that, or are you expecting us to go into more detail about the mirror neurons? Just answer the question.
Just answer the question and don't answer it in a complete sentence. Really, I just want the answer. I hate complete sentences. I do. There's like so much to read through. The lights are off. Does that matter? Okay. Just checking. I know. Yeah, I just can't stand reading through all the stuff that doesn't matter. So no, I just want the answer. Other questions? Yeah.
This was a question from a quiz. It says, a singer is producing a very high note. What laryngeal muscle is most active? Mm-hmm. The answer is cricothyroid, but why? Can you explain why?
Yeah, it's possible to make relatively small pitch changes by increasing the tension of the thyroarytenoid muscle. That will increase longitudinal tension. But it probably can only do maybe and I'm sure some brilliant people have measured this, maybe a few semitones, like a couple of notes on the piano. If you're doing really big changes, you have to maximally increase the longitudinal tension in the vocal folds. And the only thing that's going to do that, maximal increase of longitudinal tension, is the cricothyroid.
Why would the answer not be thyroarytenoid if that's the muscle?
Because that would only give you a little bit of pitch change. You've got a singer who's way up at 1,000 hertz. She needs a huge, huge pitch increase. So if I were saying what's going to change your pitch so you don't sound monopitch in conversation, then potentially you could use the thyroarytenoid. But for singers who are doing anything more than like a third of an octave, they have to be doing the cricothyroid.
So for normal speech, the thyroarytenoid is being used, but for more extreme, like singing, and it's the cricothyroid.
Cricothyroid. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, shall we flip back to respiration and go by section? Go ahead.
I was wondering, when we're reviewing for this exam, should we focus on instrumentation?
Only in context. So like not the minute details, but you should know the basics. Like a pneumotachograph measures airflow, spirometer measures lung volumes. You know, the most obvious ones you should know. Know the different imaging techniques, which ones have radiation, which ones don't. At this rate, we can be shorter than Dr. Dunkelberger's. No.
As far as, I know we obviously need to know everything, but should we focus more on like conceptual, like for example, the respiratory system, like if we can explain coherently, you know, how it works and we have a good working knowledge of that, but we don't necessarily need to know the detail, like it's the size of half a tennis court, like all that
Correct.
Kind of stuff like that.
Know the concepts and how it works.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. A lot of minutiae I don't care about, but if you can tell me, you do need to know things like gas exchange and, you know, how that happens. But the main thing is, with the respiratory system, to put it in context, the issues of passive relaxation forces and active muscle forces where the person is in resting expiratory level, the stuff we went over last time.
Can you kind of go over that a little bit? Because I remember that being very confusing.
Or a whole bunch.
A whole bunch.
Yeah, I don't know that I can make it sound any different than I did last time. So when you think about passive forces and active muscle forces, the context is now we're superimposing speech on our regular old quiet breathing. So we know that quiet breathing uses minimal muscle effort, okay? We use the diaphragm, the external intercostals to inhale for quiet breathing. And what do we do to exhale? Relax, okay? So you don't even have any muscle forces there. So resting expiratory level is the point within the respiratory system where everything is in balance. And because of that, how much you are above or below it determines how strong the relaxation forces are and how much muscle effort you're going to need to counteract it if you're trying to talk over those relaxation forces. Okay, so if we just let the relaxation forces do their thing, I'd taken a big breath, let it out, and I wouldn't be able to say a thing on it. But because I want to be able to regulate airflow and produce long phrases, if I breathe in and say I'm planning to drive you nuts and talk for 5 minutes on one breath, okay? So, and at this point, if I relax, you have relaxation forces in the expiratory direction. It's only logical that to counteract them, I need active muscle forces in the inspiratory direction. Okay, they're always going to be opposite each other when you're trying to control the respiratory system to speak over its natural tendencies. Okay? So let's say that I haven't put you to sleep yet, and I'm determined to keep on talking, and now I go below resting expiratory level, and I keep on talking, and I feel my abs start to tighten, and I feel my throat start to tighten, and I keep on going anyway until I'm ready to turn blue. Natural relaxation forces are in which direction? Inspiratory. So what did I use to keep on talking? What active muscle forces? Expiratory. Okay? So when you're trying to figure it out, put yourself in one of those extremes and relax. And that will tell you the direction of the natural passive relaxation forces. Okay, there's no such thing as a passive muscle force. Okay, if it's muscle, it's active. It's a muscle, it's contracting. Okay, so the passive forces are relaxation forces. You counteract them so you can talk over it with active muscle forces. Does that help? It's one of the weirder concepts to get. Some of the ugliest diagrams in speech science are about that. The other thing to remember about keeping those forces in balance to speak on is that the main thing you're trying to do is maintain a constant subglottal pressure. Okay, the whole point about balance within the within the relaxation forces and the muscle forces is to keep a constant subglottal pressure no matter where you are. So what perceptual phenomena does subglottal pressure relate to? If I increase subglottal pressure, what happens? Loudness. So if I don't keep that constant, then all of a sudden you have something going like this. It's awful, right? So the listener always expects a constant loudness. And it's one of the most distracting speech features that certain types of people with certain types of dysarthria have. Ataxic dysarthria is a problem with controlling and coordinating across all of the systems. They end up sounding like they're blurts of loudness, and then they go soft for a while, then they go loud. It makes you crazy. So keep in mind that you're trying to balance those forces to keep around a 5 centimeter of water pressure, subglottal pressure. Other respiratory stuff. Yeah.
Could you go over the singer's residual volume a little bit?
Sure. We know that there are factors that influence a person's absolute lung volume. So if somebody has a really big vital capacity, what's the most likely reason why? Or what's that person going to be like? Big, tall guy. Okay? So physical size probably makes the biggest difference in vital capacity. Someone was telling me the other day they catered something for the opera, and all of the singers were like gigundous. Huge barrel-chested men, big women, not a petite person among them. And so all of these highly trained opera singers also happen to have really big vital capacities, which is a huge advantage for them for singing. So physically they might have some advantage if they're just a big person. I mean, if you look at all of the really, the superstars of opera, there is not a petite little elfin person among them. So we know that size has a huge difference, makes a huge impact in vital capacity. But for singers, they have a smaller residual volume because they've learned to use more of their vital capacity. Okay, so remember, residual volume is the amount of air that's left in the lungs after you've exhaled as much as you possibly can. Now, when I was a student, I used to think that that air just stayed there all the time, little fermented thing down there. It does get exchanged. It sort of moves up in your lungs after a while. So it's not like it never leaves. But it's the air that's left because of the pleural linkage, right? So we know the pleural linkage attaches the lungs to the rib cage. When the pleural linkage is intact, the lungs can never collapse. So they always have some air in them, no matter how much I try to squeeze that air out. The air that's left is residual volume. And singers, because of their training, have learned to get into produce really a larger vital capacity. They have figured out how to squeeze all of the air out more than we can do. So it's really an effective training. So the other things that we mentioned that can affect vital capacity are things like physical conditioning. What sport's the best? You guys remember?
Swimming.
Swimming. You're breathing against a resistance. But still, you've got physical constraints. So, you know, I can be in terrific condition, and if I'm still a little petite gymnast, my vital capacity is never going to be what an Olympic basketball player's is. Okay, you always have constraints of your physical structure. So there are definitely limitations to vital capacity. So what we care about when we're measuring it is predicted, based on the person's age and gender and some measure of body mass, usually just height. What do we know their vital capacity should be? Okay, so it's a predicted vital capacity based on those variables. So I'm not expecting a little gymnast to have the same vital capacity as a basketball player. Okay, we're going to make it proportional to their size and their age. Okay? Yeah.
Regarding the learning how to use more of the vital capacity, I want to make sure I understand the concept of why the residual volume's there. Like, I thought it was because the thorax keeps the lungs slightly, more expanded because of the pleural linkage. So, if that's kind of a physical restraint, how could they learn how to overcome it, or is that just
the magic of singing teaching? I don't know. I've never asked the guy that I collaborate with how they do that. But you're limited too in terms of how big a breath you can take in. So you're limited in both dimensions. I think they might have more tolerance. I think there could be a few things going on. I think they might have more tolerance for going very, very low in their vital capacity curve. I think they may literally be able to squeeze out more air without it sounding strained here. Usually when we go below resting expiratory level, we start to sound kind of strained. We don't have enough air to support it. So I really think a lot of it is just a matter of training and practice sustaining long phrases without changing the acoustic quality of that phrase. And I don't think they do it a huge amount. I mean, nobody has said that singers have like half the residual volume that other people do. We just know it's less. Other respiratory questions? Yeah.
In that section, there were lots of vocabulary and definitions. I know you said you seem to be posing the questions in a more practical form. What
are you thinking of in terms of the vocabulary?
Well, you gave us specific definitions and told us know what vital capacity is as far as like define it.
Yeah, now you need to be able to put it in context mainly about where the person is in their vital capacity curve.
Okay.
And how it impacts how they're going to breathe for speech.
Okay.
That's the part that matters.
Okay.
So if I tell you a person is ready to sing an aria, what part of their vital capacity curve are they in? That's the part that I want you to know. And that would be? So if I take in a huge breath and I'm ready to sing, where am I in the vital capacity curve? At the top, yeah. What volume is it? Inspiratory reserve volume, yeah. Other respiratory stuff. Mm-hmm.
During the infant toddler speech breathing PowerPoint, you talked about a couple studies, and can you clarify exactly what you were trying to get with those? It was so confusing then.
Give me some hint about what the studies are.
You had the speech breathing in 7-year-olds compared to 10, 13, 16-year-olds,
okay.
and then...
So the main point, let's start with that one. The main point with the different speech breathing patterns with age, okay? We know that younger children have to work harder to breathe. Okay, now this is like 7-year-olds, not the little bitty guys, okay? So the younger children have to work harder to breathe simply because their airways are smaller. Okay, so there's more resistance. All of the tubing is smaller, the vocal folds are smaller, the trachea is smaller. So they're fighting resistance. And so they tend to talk louder because they're always trying to overcome resistance. So they're working harder, they tend to talk louder, and things start to get more adult-like in the older age groups, like 13, 16, around there. So the main contrast is younger kids, not babies, but younger kids compared to older kids.
And how it's different for them.
Why they talk louder.
Compared to when they're past puberty.
Exactly. And everything's gotten bigger. Yeah, mainly because it's gotten bigger. I don't think people change the way they use it, but it's just naturally easier. Yeah, exactly. More space. Uh-huh. What was the other study?
The 10, 13, 16-year-olds. I think you already covered that,
Yeah.
though.
Yeah. So just know the extremes. And you remember the little newbie stuff about why the kids have such a hard time breathing? That one's pretty basic to relate to. Compliant rib cage, high elasticity in the lungs. Other respiratory stuff. Okay, let's go on to laryngeal. You're welcome to come back if you think of something, but let's at least get through everything once. Yeah.
I think this is right before laryngeal, but I have spectral analysis versus spectrum. I don't know the difference between those.
Spectral analysis versus a spectrum? But there isn't a difference. So you use spectral analysis to get to a spectrum. And the spectrum is the one that you think of as frequency along the horizontal axis, amplitude here. I suppose some people would call what you generate as a spectrogram also spectral analysis. So it could be kind of a catch-all term. Yeah.
I heard you mention a while back that you said you might get us to label or draw some of the pictures.
Mm-hmm. You won't draw them. There are things that are drawn.
So we need to know the X and Y axes of them?
The ones that are drawn are spectrograms. So those are the ones where time goes along the horizontal axis and frequency is the vertical axis. Let me just draw one since I have this. Okay, so time's here, frequency's here, and then the strength of the signal is how dark a band is or how dark the energy is. So what I'd like you to be able to recognize is just really gross characteristics associated with certain sounds. So if I would give you the word socks, for example, you would look for something that had high frequency noise, an ah, that's probably like here, a k, that would be a spike, and ts, more high frequency noise. Okay, so if I give you ma'am, you would expect to see, you'd look for something that had low frequency energy for the nasal murmur. It would probably go right into a vowel and then low frequency energy again. Okay, so really just the most obvious sounds. Okay, so remember if you're looking for an E, you expect to see a very low frequency first formant, a relatively high second formant. That always tells you it's an E sound. Okay, if you're looking for a plosive, you're always looking for a spike. And if you're looking for a fricative, you're always looking for some kind of noise. R's and L's, you're looking for swirly stuff. That's the technical term. Actually, that's more of an R. The L is the one that's that weird looking one. Okay? So just know the extremes. Anything else on acoustics? Okay, acoustics, laryngeal.
Are we going to have to label any of the laryngeal systems? Like,
nope.
Okay.
If I can't draw them, you don't need to label them. Yeah. I like that.
In the very first lecture, do we need to know like the goals of speech therapy and the advantages and disadvantages?
God, if you don't know that by now. I mean, really. I think that should be inherent knowledge at this point. So it's not anatomy, no labeling, but you need to know what the stuff does.
Okay. The layers of the vocal folds. There's 3 layers, 4 layers.
Why don't we just go through it?
Yeah. My question was, I remember when you were teaching it to us, I was picturing it as they were developing separately and not all together, like they don't form into one another. Can you clarify that?
Yeah. You know, it's one of those areas that we don't know a lot about, and I'm sure I mentioned this before. It's good. The only way you learn them is by doing autopsies, so we don't want to have a lot of knowledge about little babies' vocal folds. But the part that I really want you to understand is the layered structure in the adult. Well, let's go to the extreme. So in the baby, it's pretty much all superficial layer. You know, they have the thyroarytenoid muscle, and then they just have the superficial layer. It's really, really not complex. It's why babies sound so shrill and, you know, so much like a pure tone, because the vocal folds aren't vibrating in any complex way at all. But when you get to an adult, the lamina propria is very well developed, and you start out here with the mucosa, or the epithelial layer. Okay, that's just like the lining inside your mouth. That's just the covering, the thing that looks shiny and white when we look at pictures of the vocal folds. Then we have the superficial layer, and that's the one that is collagenous. That's the one that vibrates really, really easily, and that's the one that's most engaged in vibration. Okay, so when the vocal folds are vibrating, it's all of the superficial layers involved. Next is the intermediate layer, which is the next one in. That's the one that is made up of elastic fibers. And these elastic fibers are running lengthwise. They run along the length of the same direction as the thyroarytenoid does. Okay, so the elasticity is in longitudinal direction. So when the vocal folds are stretched out to do a high pitch, they can come right back, aided by the elastic fibers. And then the deep layer is the next one in. And that's where you have, I didn't mean this, I misspoke. Yes, put the collagenous ones in the deep layer. And put the gelatinous stuff, gelatinous, collagenous. They're not interchangeable, no matter what your instructor says. So gelatinous is the superficial layer, collagenous is the deep layer, and the way to remember that is collagenous and cotton, because these are the thick, sturdy, cotton-like fibers. Okay? And then, so that's the lamina propria, and then you get to, that's sort of like the hot dog bun around the thyroarytenoid muscle. Okay, so the thyroarytenoid muscle is deep in here. So we know that the composition of the lamina propria changes as people age. And remember that difference between physiological age and chronological age. So if a person is still a performing singer and has been a classically trained singer and continues to use their voice and do vocalese and vocal exercises and stuff, they probably won't experience a lot of changes in the lamina propria. Most of the changes are most obvious in women, and they're most obvious after menopause. Okay, so the biggest changes are in the deep layer, where the collagenous fibers get thicker. The deep layer is the collagenous fibers. Intermediate, the elastic fibers lose their elasticity. The gelatinous layer tends to become more likely to be fluid-filled or edematous. And all of this is adding mass. When you add mass to the vocal folds, you lower the frequency. Okay, so the fundamental frequency lowers. In men, the changes aren't understood nearly as well. There are certainly some classic old men's voices that we think of as kind of higher pitched and thin. But there are a lot of older men's voices that aren't like that. So the changes with age aren't nearly as apparent in men as they are in women. Yeah, I think that's the main stuff. Mm-hmm.
So the time period when you're a child and you have mostly superficial layer, that time period between then and then when you have all three layers, are they always present? They're just slowly developing, or do they come one at a time?
They're slowly sort of discriminating themselves.
Okay.
So it starts out as one layer, and then the intermediate layer starts to appear, and then the deep layer starts to appear. So by the time the person is through puberty, they've got all of the layers in the rich, complex voice that we expect, as opposed to the little boys' choir voices, you know, that are those thin, pure tone voices. Other laryngeal questions? Yeah.
This may be overly specific, but technically is the epithelial layer considered part of the lamina propria? Because in the pictures that we have, it sort of brackets just the superficial, intermediate, and deep together as the lamina propria.
Yeah, you know, people divide that thing up in so many different ways. I guess technically it's not. Most people would think of as the layered part being the lamina propria. Remember, the other distinction too is just the cover and the body. So the lamina propria is the cover and the thyroarytenoid is the body. And some people even change that and put the deep layer with the thyroarytenoid. So the classification and categorization of that is, yeah. Know what the layers have in them and how they vibrate. Yeah.
And in the exam, are you gonna like say something like a person is not so happy with the strobe going down nose? What other tool would you be using?
Well, that's a good question. Sure. The ones that are most finely discriminated on the exam, where you really need to know the instrumentation, are the imaging techniques. So fMRI versus CAT scan versus MRI, those you need to know. What do they show you, and is radiation used? Yeah.
So then we don't really need to know too much about the other instruments then in that case, just the imaging, or?
Well, you know, there aren't all that many. So, you know, I think it's good to know if you want to look at how somebody's vocal folds actually vibrate, what would you use? Which would be laryngeal video stroboscopy, okay? And probably the rigid scope, the one that goes in their mouth rather than their nose. So, you know, I consider that to be fairly basic. Yeah.
So when the vocal folds are vibrating, the mucosa is what's blowing apart, and then what's under it stays still?
Yes.
Okay.
So the way to think about that is when you're ready to talk, you breathe in, you bring the vocal folds to the midline, so they're touching, and then they stay there, basically. Okay, so the thyroarytenoid is going to stay in one place, and the mucosa is what's moving. Okay, so it has a stable base of the thyroarytenoid, and then the only thing that's actually participating in vibration is the mucosa and the superficial layer. Okay, everything else keeps it there. Then you take a breath, it opens up, goes back to that phonatory set position. Okay, that's a really important point because it's one that a lot of people mix up. It's not for each vibration that the vocal folds open this way. Okay, it's just really being blown, yeah, right, the hula thing, really being blown apart in the middle. But you've got a stable set of the muscles aren't moving in this direction. They may be moving longitudinally to change longitudinal tension, but they're not moving this way. That stays stable.
So the mucosa includes the 4 layers, or just the superficial layer that you're referring to?
When people are talking about vibration, it's going to depend on the type of voice that the person's producing, particularly the register. So in a falsetto voice in a guy, they may only have like a little bit of the superficial layer vibrating or actually being displaced. If it's a modal register in a man and it's good chest resonance, you could have some of the intermediate layer vibrating as well. But picture mainly the superficial layer doing it. And then that most important part of the thyroarytenoid providing stability. So that's the body, and it's the cover that's doing the vibrating.
I have that the hoarseness is a combination of the breathiness and the harshness, but if one has incomplete closure, but the other one is very tight muscle use, and because of closure, how do you combine the two?
It's best to think of, I wouldn't define them quite that way. So if you're talking about hoarseness, you know there's breathiness and harshness. So breathiness in that case is incomplete closure. So when the vocal folds are supposed to be having the mucosa touch here, they're not during vibration. Okay, so there's incomplete closure that gives you breathiness. And then it's aperiodic vibration that gives you harshness. Okay, so they're doing both at once. Now, the reason that you're thinking of the strained pressed voice for harshness is that's the one that's most likely for us to be able to really hear that aperiodic vibration. But it can be present in a more relaxed production. So if I go, ah, there's breathiness and harshness. So you hear kind of that rough quality to it, and you hear lots of air escaping. Okay, so that one's hoarse. And then if it's just breathiness, ah, you don't hear the roughness. All you hear is lots of air. And then harshness, the only way I can ever do harshness is really tight and pressed, like ah, and there's no extra air escaping there at all.
So harshness is the only one that's associated with muscle tension?
No, harshness is just aperiodic vibration. So if I have, for example, one vocal fold that's paralyzed, the innervation to it at some point means the thyroarytenoid muscle itself is going to atrophy. And then this one that's innervated fine stays okay. They're not going to be vibrating. They're not setting the vocal folds up to vibrate periodically. So there might not be any tension there at all, but they're still not going to vibrate periodically. Because remember the cover body and how you have to have, how it's the body tension that really determines how the cover is going to vibrate. One can be different from the other if there's paralysis. So you can have aperiodicity without tension.
Well, in that case, wouldn't it be hoarse? Wouldn't you have breathiness in that scenario?
Yeah, probably because the paralyzed vocal fold's probably not going to come to the midline. But some people do compensate for it. Some people bring the healthy vocal fold across the midline. So if you're one of those people who goes, damn it, I'm not going to sound breathy, and swings the vocal fold over, you could have aperiodic vibration without breathiness. So it can happen, but just think about breathiness as incomplete closure, harshness is aperiodic vibration. Yeah.
I'm a little confused with the difference between nasality and hypernasality because my definitions seem pretty much the same.
Yeah, I think the distinction we want is between nasalence or nasalization and hypernasality. So nasalization means that the velopharyngeal port is open, and basically the nasal cavity can communicate with the vocal tract. That's just nasalization. So when is nasalization okay? M, N, and NG. Okay? We're good with nasalization there. Hypernasality, and a lot of speech pathologists use those terms interchangeably, and it's probably not great. So a lot of people will say nasality when they mean hypernasality. Okay? And that just means that you have nasal resonance on sounds that are not nasals. Okay, and then remember what sounds, what are the only sounds that can be denasal? Nasals. Nasals are the only sounds that can be denasal. So even though a person has a weird kind of resonance when they have a cold, technically you can only be denasal on those 3 nasal sounds. So that's the lack of nasal resonance where you expect it.
So would it be nasal emission or hypernasality where you would, I'm sorry, I just messed up my question. Would it be hypernasality or denasalization where you would have nasal emission?
Neither.
Neither.
So nasal air emission is different from nasal resonance. Nasal air emission is where you can actually hear air come out of the nose. And it almost always occurs on high pressure sounds. So if I'm being hypernasal, I'll sound like this all the time and you won't really notice anything like nasal emission. If I have nasal air emission, I'm going Peter, hyper, hect. So I'm not hypernasal all the time, but on those high pressure sounds you hear some snorting. Okay? Yeah.
On words like man, where there's a vowel in between and it's going to be affected by the nasality, is it, I don't know if this is even possible, but if someone somehow leaves off the nasality on the vowel, would it then be, I know it's not a nasal, but would that be denasal?
We would perceive it as sounding weird. So within a nasal context, and what you're getting at is like assimilative nasality. Within a nasal context, there's an amount of assimilative nasality that's natural. We expect to hear ma'am. We expect to hear some, on the ah. If I could figure out how to do it without that, it would be perceived as odd. So, but when assimilative nasality is pathological, is if you'd hear ma'am, mim, where it's really just, you know the vowel has way too much. Because that would indicate that the velopharyngeal port wasn't closing at all for the ah. It's a sneeze. It's all right. Yes.
When we do laryngeal tension, are we tensing the whole larynx or just longitudinal tension?
Are laryngeal tension for what purpose? For the purpose of manifesting stress or for the purpose of changing pitch?
The vibrato, like suppressing vibrato.
Oh, suppressing vibrato. Okay. So if you're suppressing vibrato, you are probably increasing medial compression to do that. Because it's very, very hard to suppress vibrato and be quiet about it. So if I'm going, ah, you hear some vibrato in there, but ah, you don't. I can't do that quietly. So it's increased medial compression that tends to suppress vibrato. That's in that classic belting style, the tomorrow thing. Just nasty. But the other question regarding just tension within the vocal folds, longitudinal tension is what we use to make pitch changes. But there are people who have excess laryngeal tension to the point where the thyroarytenoid is tense and the supraglottal structures come in and the whole area is tense. People, and we see them fairly frequently on TV, skinny little news reporters who sound kind of harsh. You can see all of their throat muscles working. Some singers, when they increase pitch and don't do it very healthily, you see all the throat muscles going. I think we probably even looked at a picture of Mick Jagger. I mean, his whole body is just like, So that's the kind of tension that isn't good because it's overgeneralized. So the whole body is working way, way too much to be phonating at that point. So the good kind of tension is just the longitudinal tension we have to increase pitch, and then anything else beyond that is considered too much. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
The vertical phase shift and the longitudinal phase shift, I'm having, I can picture the vertical, but I can't picture the longitudinal. Could you go over that, please?
Yeah, the longitudinal is weird because it's not nearly as easily seen. It simply means that along the length of the vocal folds. The vocal folds don't open and close uniformly. And I always forget which direction it goes in. Either the front opens first and then the back, or the back opens first and then the front. But it's not open-close like this. Okay, so there's an opening at one end before the other end, longitudinally. It's not terribly affected by mass of the vocal folds, which is really the big factor in the vertical phase shift. So in men with bass voices, they have incredible vertical phase shift that you can see the bottom part opens first and then the top, and they come together. In tenors, you might not see that, and in women, you really don't see it. So the vertical phase shift shows up the most on thick vocal folds. The longitudinal one you can see in both, but you really have to be looking for it. It's just not as obvious. Both of them, though, contribute to that self-sustained oscillation. Remember, we talked about the non-linear part of vocal fold vibration that sort of gives energy back to the system. Both the longitudinal and the vertical phase shift are part of that. It's one of the things that makes it relatively easy for us to talk. Mm-hmm.
When you were talking about harmonic spacing, can you clarify, like, when their spacing is spread apart versus when they're closer together?
Yep. So when you're thinking about harmonic spacing, the first thing you want to get in mind is a spectrum. And we'll just do an extreme one here. So harmonic spacing for a singer who's singing at 1,000 hertz is going to be 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, on up. Harmonic spacing for a man who is phonating at 100 hertz is going to be 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000. So up to 1,000, you can see how much more energy there is in this man's acoustic spectrum compared to this one person who's singing at 1,000 hertz. Okay, so the denseness of the spectrum, or the denseness of the harmonics, all depends on what the fundamental frequency is. And a high fundamental frequency gives you very, very spaced out harmonics, and low fundamental frequencies give you really dense, strong acoustic spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Can you review the myoelastic aerodynamic theory, like how that works?
How it works. Sure. And this is something you should know. So it all goes along with picturing the first cycle of vocal fold vibration. Okay? So I'm going to breathe in. What muscles do I use to bring the vocal folds to the midline? Lateral cricoarytenoid and interrytenoids. Okay, so I have the whole length of the vocal folds to the midline. And now I'm going to build up subglottal pressure. And you guys remember what phonation threshold pressure is? Minimum amount of subglottal pressure to initiate vibration. So if I have really, really healthy vocal folds, I'm all warmed up, what should my phonation threshold pressure be like? It's going to be high or low? Low. It's not going to take much pressure to blow healthy vocal folds apart. So maybe 3 centimeters of water pressure. Okay? If my vocal folds are such that I just woke up in the morning and I have allergies and they're all fluid filled, phonation threshold pressure could be more like 6 to 8 centimeters of water pressure. Okay? So healthy vocal folds without a lot of extra fluid will have minimal phonation threshold pressure. So we use muscle forces to bring the vocal folds to the midline. But once they're there, it's really, so that's the myo part. Once they're there, it's really air that is going to, air and elasticity that's going to keep them vibrating. So I build up enough subglottal pressure, the air blows the vocal folds apart. The elasticity of the tissues, just because they want to be back where they were before, brings them together. And that's it. Okay, so it's a fairly straightforward theory that I think everybody pretty much accepts now is how things work. Mm-hmm.
As far as the Bernoulli effect, I mean, is it sufficient that we just know that it's sort of important at the very end and helps them sort of suck back together, and that's about it?
There are physicists who don't believe that it exists in the vocal folds, but we can't seem to get rid of that concept. So if you have to believe in Bernoulli, put it at the very, very, very end. So when the vocal folds are like a half a millimeter apart, the Bernoulli effect will suck them together. That's as much credit as I'm going to give them. So. So you're pretty good with the rest of the laryngeal stuff? And we talked some about VP stuff. Any other velopharyngeal things? Yeah.
All the shapes of the different types of closure, I mean, just kind of no...
No coronal's the most common. Palatal elevation. Yeah. And the thing that I always thought was most interesting about the shapes of closure is you're always taught to believe that it's a complete circular seal, and it's just not. You know, most people, the lateral and posterior pharyngeal walls just don't move. And they don't sound hypernasal, and they get VP closure perfectly fine. So what about the little kids and having a hard time breathing? Like the 3 to 5 year olds? What makes them have a hard time breathing? Yeah.
Isn't it their adenoids or their tonsils being too big sometimes, or the sleep apnea?
You're on the right track. So the soft tissue grows faster than the bony tissue. Okay, so all the soft tissue in their nasal cavity and the back of their throat is growing faster than their skull is growing. And if you ever look in a little 3-year-old's mouth, it looks like it's just stuffed with soft tissue. There just seems amazing they can breathe at all. So it makes it difficult for them to breathe through the nose. And then the disorder that can happen as a result of the difficulty breathing? Sleep apnea, okay? So if you notice, if you're a speech pathologist in the schools, what are some of the things that you might notice that could make you suspect that a kid has sleep apnea? Yeah.
They're really small.
Yeah, because growth hormone's released in the deepest stages of sleep. Okay, so they're little kids. What else? Mouth breathers. If they snore during class, yes, if they sleep during class, they'll be snoring. Pardon me? Yeah, they're the ones who might have behavior problems, be diagnosed wrongly with ADD because they're just wiped. So if you see behavioral problems, one of the first things you want to do is get to the parents and say, how well does your kid sleep at night? So if you see a kid and you go, probably sleep apnea, I'm kind of worried about his breathing, what are you going to recommend?
Sleep study.
Sleep study. Who's the doctor you're going to send the kid to, though? Send him to an ENT. Okay, and then the ENT will look in their mouth and go, yeah, tonsils look really big. You say the kid never sleeps. They'll recommend the sleep study. Typically, the family doctor won't do it, though. You have to get to a specialist. And that's gotten better. It used to be next to impossible to get little kids' tonsils taken out. But they're finally coming around to realize that it's a good thing for a child to breathe. So they're doing it more often. Yeah. Other VP stuff. Okay. Yeah.
Do we need to know like specific numbers for different areas, like the mid-Atlantic for the normative nasal?
Oh God, no. But you should know sort of the ballpark, like around 28%. If a person's below 28, they're going to be fine. We know there's some regional differences that most people can hear. But the other thing to keep in mind is even when those regional differences get kind of high, you wouldn't technically call it hypernasality. You know, I don't know that we have a great term for that twangy quality. I mean, to me, it's not a twang with the New Yorker that sounds like this. You know, that's not a twang. That's just ugly. It's, but you know, there's higher nasal resonance in the Mid-Atlantic states. There's certainly higher nasal resonance in country singers that don't open their mouth when they sing. But it's not hypernasal. It's just increased nasal resonance. Yeah. You represent that whole quadrant, don't you? Yes.
I'm going to jump to the odd quarter wavelength theory.
Oh, you brave soul.
When you're explaining that you go half and then 3/4 and then 5/4, is the sound or the actually coming up the trachea to the mouth? Okay, I'm just like confused. Like I can't actually picture it. Like, is it the sound that's coming there and it's stopping at the lips, or what is it?
It is the wavelength that's produced by the frequencies that the vocal folds are generating. Okay, so if you go back and look at this, we know that 100 hertz has a relatively long wavelength. Okay, we know that 1,000 hertz has a really short wavelength. When you think about the quarter wavelength theory, you're actually picturing physically putting those wavelengths in the vocal tract. Like, do they fit from the vocal folds out to the mouth?
What would be an example of that? Like, can you give us a sound or whatever is?
Well, you have to remember that when you are speaking, what's going through the vocal folds is a spectrum. Okay, so you have lots of different frequencies going through the vocal tract all at once. So if I'm speaking at 200 hertz, I've got 200, 400, 600, 800, all at the same time going through the vocal folds. Each of those frequencies, so 200 hertz has a specific physical length associated with its waveform. A certain amount of that will fit into my vocal tract. And so if the resonators are in a neutral position, a quarter for F1, the frequencies whose wavelengths, a quarter of which, took me forever to learn to say that, a quarter of which fit into the vocal tract will be resonated as the first formant. So let's say this band of frequencies has a wavelength that's kind of close to what a quarter of which will fit into my vocal tract. Okay, this band of frequency doesn't. They lose energy. This next band of frequencies will be F2, and they have a wavelength, 3/4 of which physically fits in my vocal tract. So this band of frequencies around here will make it through. And you just go on up from there. So you always think of like regions of frequencies and the physical wavelength for a neutral vocal tract. And then things shift when you put tongue constriction in there.
I may be getting this confused, but is for you to get to that point where you're using the fractions to figure out which frequencies get that far, is it due to when you were just talking about this, the frequencies, some being stronger than others, and you lose some due to the tissues and etc.?
I'm not sure where you're going with that, though. Can you give me more? What you're thinking about, though, is the formula works. The 1/4, 3/4, and 5/4 works for a schwa sound, where the whole length of the vocal tract is the same dimension, cross-sectionally, from the vocal folds to the lips. Okay? And that's sort of the classic one where when you think about the formula, what matters is the length of the vocal tract. You're dividing by 4 times the length of the vocal tract. So the little kid, 4 times the length of a little kid's vocal tract, will have higher formants than a big guy. Okay, not because the vocal folds are shorter, but because the length of the vocal tract is shorter. Okay, so that's what's determining. The biggest determinant for formant frequencies is how long the vocal tract is. Because again, you have to figure that physical dimension of space. The length of the vocal tract is going to tell you how much of a wavelength will fit in. Okay? But always think about a spectrum being produced at the level of the vocal folds and that whole spectrum traveling through. And then certain of those frequencies will resonate and certain ones won't. Yeah.
With the formula, are we going to have to calculate like we did on the quiz? No.
Nope. Just know the big concepts. You don't even need a calculator. See, now don't you all feel better about it? Yeah.
I have in my notes just In my notes, I have be able to draw sine waves and complex waves for the final. Is that going to be in relation to?
I lied.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't have to. As long as you know that what we produce is a complex wave. Anytime you have more than one frequency, you have a complex wave. Okay? The only time you have a simple waveform is a sine wave, a single frequency. Okay? That's it. Yeah.
Can you explain more about how we use the same frequency to generate sound, like the bouncing back of the frequency? Is it like
keep going?
I don't know. It was something about we're using the same frequency, not actually.
That the frequency doesn't change at the.
Oh, are you okay? You're talking about the source filter theory, basically, I think. So the source is the fundamental frequency and all of the harmonics, and the source can be modified in lots of different ways, but the fundamental frequency and the harmonics stay the same.
It was something about, like, I think in the videos, how like the frequency before it escapes, it just bounces back.
Yeah, and you know that's always kind of a hard concept because the whole basis of acoustics is standing waves. But I always have a hard time picturing standing waves because speech happens so fast. But technically what happens is we produce acoustic energy that comes out of the vocal tract, hits a huge wall of atmosphere, and bounces back. So you have a propagating wave that's the waveform going out. You have a reflected wave bouncing back. And that creates a standing wave within the vocal tract.
Is that the one we use for speech?
That's the one that makes the sounds that we say.
Okay.
The standing waves. But you know, standing waves to me have to be like, okay, I can picture a standing wave there. I have a hard time picturing it in dynamic speech, but it's happening all the time. We're always doing propagation and reflection. But that's a tough concept. So, you know, don't worry about that one. Worry about don't worry about it. Think about the things, how the formants shift with the change in tongue position. That matters. So if you have a small space behind the tongue, what's F1 going to be like? High or low? High. Little space makes for high frequencies. So what sound is going to have the highest F1 and the lowest F2? Has to be a vowel because we're talking about formants. Because it's a back sound. You have a little space back here and a huge space here. High F1, low F2. And the E is the next best one to compare. Always go with the quantal vowels to figure out the formants. So the E, because its front has a huge space back here. So what's that going to do to F1? Really low. And a relatively small space in front of the tongue, which is the constriction. So F2 is going to be what? High. Yeah. And then if I go ooh, and I added lip rounding, what does that do across the board? Lowers. And why does it lower both F1 and F2? Lengthen the vocal tract. So singers can lengthen the vocal tract by lowering the larynx as well as rounding the lips. So they can tune the frequencies even more than we naturally would in speech. But when you're thinking about the formants, you think about the length of the vocal tract and where the constriction or where the tongue is. Yeah.
Will you ask us to identify other vowels other than the quantal vowels?
No, those are the biggies.
Okay.
Just know that.
Okay.
I know people who've studied speech science forever who couldn't find an I versus an E on a spectrogram. So you don't have to do that. Yeah.
Can you explain again about how the singers are trained and are well trained to lower the length
well,
of
not
their...
just to lower the larynx. Singers are trained to tune the vocal tract, essentially. So they're working with the spectrum that's produced, but they don't want to lose energy. Okay, so singers are going for acoustic power over intelligibility. Singers could care less if you understand the vowel sounds. Okay, what they want is a gorgeous, powerful voice. So the way that they do it is they actually shift the position or the height of the larynx And even more importantly, they shift the position of the tongue so that they're changing the resonant frequencies. So that they're going to make the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract match the fundamental frequency of the note. Okay, so they're tuning it.
But how do they do that?
By moving their tongue. So you can actually do this. Go ahead and try it. It's going to sound weird, but see if you can hear yourself. So if you sing up a scale and you really, really, really don't move your tongue at all, you'll go, ah, ah. Okay, if I let myself move my tongue, I go, ah. You hear a whole different sound energy produced. So what I'm doing is slightly shifting my tongue so that I can make the resonating frequencies match the pitch that I'm producing. So you're just trying to not lose energy. You don't want to have the parts of the spectrum damped out. But you literally do it by moving your tongue. And as soon as you move your tongue, you change the vowel sound. So nobody understands the vowels of singers. But they got this great sound. So do you remember the bit with the 1,000 hertz fundamental frequency? Why is that unintelligible? So if you have it, go ahead.
F1 isn't in the spectrum, possibly. If the where it begins, like 1,000 hertz, if it's above F1, then F1 isn't there, and you need F1 and F2 to distinguish a vowel.
Yes. So if you have a soprano who's singing at 1,000 hertz, there is no frequency to resonate in the region of F1. No energy exists there. So all the listener's going to hear is F2. And to perceive vowels accurately, you have to have both F1 and F2. So if she shifts downward and then suddenly sings something at 200 hertz, you go, yeah, I understand that. That's an E. But when she's way up there, F1 doesn't exist. Okay? Yeah.
Going back to vocal fold vibration, when you talk about the vertical phase shift and the longitudinal phase shift, do they happen at the same time?
They do, and it's really hard to picture that happening at the same time, but they do. Some people do great hula dancer diagrams, but my fingers don't go that way. But picture, I think the important thing about the phase shifts is to picture it mainly happening in male vocal folds. For vertical phase shift to really be obvious, you have to have thick vocal folds. Little kids are not going to have any vertical phase shift at all, but you'll see a longitudinal phase shift. The best voices to see vertical phase shift is basses. They've got lots of mass on the vocal folds. So it probably happens to some extent in all vocal folds, but we really, really can't see it. Okay, 5 minutes for last bids of desperation, or just another question, not to imply you're desperate.
I don't know how important this is for the final, but I have a hard time distinguishing with how babies learn language, phase 1 or phase 2 and phase 3.
Yeah, don't worry about the details of the phases. With babies learning language, the important thing, I don't even remember how much of this we talked about. What did we get to? The perceptual magnet theory?
Yeah, for phase 2 and then phase 3, general to specific.
Okay. So the concept behind babies learning really the sounds of the language, not really the language, but the sounds that they need for their language. When babies are from birth to about 6 months of age, they have this incredible auditory system that can discriminate across all sounds in any language. So even if our little American kid never heard a Swedish person speak, this little American baby would know, oh, that U is different from U, which is different from U. You know, all the Swedish rounded vowels. They'd hear differences in all of them. And then once the kid gets to about 6 months of age, it's going, I don't need all those U, U, ah, U things. I'm not Swedish. And so it goes, ooh, okay, that's one I got to have. And that's it. So they are considered, my favorite phrase is citizens of the world. So newbies are citizens of the world and can perceive all of the differences in all of the sounds produced in any language. And then once they get to about 6 months of age, they go, I'm not hearing that. and they collapse it. And they collapse down to the sounds that matter in their language. Now, the other thing to remember, though, for those of you who might have kids in the future, this doesn't mean you can play tapes of Norwegian speakers to your kids and they'll be brilliant Norwegian speakers later on. People have found that language has to be interactive. Okay, just sitting the kid in front of language tapes or playing them in its crib doesn't do it. You have to interact with the child for them to actually learn language and be engaged. But in terms of how the brain sorts out the sounds, at the beginning, they're amazing. And if you lose that, you have to spend hours in a language lab to get it again. You know, to just repeatedly try to hear the distinctions between the sounds. So it's why there are certain characteristics of foreign dialects that are so pervasive, like V for W in Germanic languages. The R's and L's mixed up in Asian languages. It's because that distinction doesn't matter in their language. So the part to know is you've got fine discrimination up to 6 months of age, citizen of the world, and then it sort of goes to what Pat Kuhl called perceptual magnets. You collapse those sounds into the ones that matter for your native language. And that's the part that matters. Yeah.
So that was basically like phase 1 and phase 2, but phase 3 is general to specific language patterns. Like when you explain it, I only kind of get 2 different things, not 3.
I think of it as 2 basic phases, really. And the other thing you need to know is there are a jillion theories about this. I happen to like Pat Kuhl's because I had her for speech perception and she's brilliant. But there are lots and lots of other theories about how kids become native speakers of languages. Hers always made sense to me. Got a couple minutes. Other questions? So when you're studying, don't just worry about the facts. Like, take the scenarios and shift them around. If this were a younger person, what would they be doing? If this were an old lady, what would she be doing? You had a question, Dan?
Just, is the Warren procedure, is that how you calculate the opening of the velopharyngeal port?
It is. The Warren procedure is not something that's clinically used a lot, because that's sort of with all the tubes in the nose and this too. So it's a pressure flow calculation that will actually give you the size of the VP port. Yeah.
You might have already kind of answered it, but as far as hoarse and harsh and breathiness, do we need to know just complete or incomplete vocal cord vibration and things like that? Do we need to know anything about muscles, since it can be
No, the muscles are hard to tell with that.
Right.
A lot of times the hoarseness is caused by the mucosa and not the muscle. In fact, almost always. So the thing to know is incomplete versus complete closure, periodic versus aperiodic vibration, and that's the way to classify it. Okay? All right, so next week, Tuesday at 2. Okay? Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed after the other final that you have. All right, see you guys.